Hello everybody, welcome. I'm Ben Powell, the Director of the Free Market Institute here at Texas Tech University. Thank you for coming out to tonight's Speaker Series event. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to just highlight the next event coming up in our series. We have former Senator and PhD economist Phil Graham will be joining us the first Monday in May to give a lecture on his new book that he just published, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. If you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that on the table. They'll have more details about the event as we get closer to the time. And while I'm excited about that event, I'm actually probably more excited about this one. I fell in love with economics when I was in college, but I fell in love with the American Revolution and the ideas that inspired it when I was much younger. As a child, I grew up 25 miles outside of Boston. And I used to go to Lexington and Concord and see the reenactments on Lexington Green, walk the Freedom Trail in Boston, and I even joined a Revolutionary War reenactment regiment. That's me as a third grader in that picture. And some of my colleagues in the regiment came to my third grade class to talk about the history of the American Revolution. And mind you, this is the 1980s. Apparently, it was still okay in Massachusetts, of all places, for people to bring functional muskets into an elementary school, along with bayonets and swords. I can tell you that these days, if I send my nieces and nephews t-shirts with Raider Red on it and he's got his guns up, they can't wear it to school or they get in trouble for having guns on their t-shirt. Different time. So I'm quite excited to have Alex talk about the ideas that inspired the revolution and their relevance today. Alex, of course, is my colleague here at the Free Market Institute. He's also the Georgie Snyder Professor of Economics in the Rawls College of Business, and he's a research fellow with the American Institute for Economic Research and the Independent Institute. He's the author of 4 books and has published more than 80 scholarly articles in academic journals. He's published literally hundreds of op-eds. He's a regular copy. His columns have appeared numerous times in the Wall Street Journal and the National Review. At times, he's been a very regular contributor to the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. And in fact, the book that he was signing beforehand and that this lecture is kind of based around grew out of a series of editorial columns he was writing about the spirit of '76 for the AJ. So we're quite pleased to be able to have him here talking about this today. Alex, please come on up and give it a go. I usually say welcome to Texas Tech, like you're on here.
It's nice, but it's easy. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to hear me talk tonight. First things first, can everyone hear me okay? We're doing okay sound-wise? Fantastic. It is my pleasure to be able to talk to you about a book that I published fairly recently. The book came out in 2023, and its title is The Spirit of '76, Libertarianism and American Renewal. As Ben said, this book grew out of a series of columns that I published in the Lubbock Avalanche Journal. And I wrote these columns intending to put them together into a book for a very specific reason. I've been increasingly worried about the concentration of discussions about politics, economics, public policy among a narrow elite. That doesn't sit well with me. One of the foundational principles of the United States is that we are governed by democratic deliberation, which requires all citizens to actively participate in these important conversations about our nation and how it works. And so I wanted to bring that conversation back to people that didn't necessarily have a PhD in economics or public policy, who didn't work full-time for the government, to the citizens of this country, who contribute to the communities, who make this country work. And as we approach our nation's 250th birthday, right, we got a pretty important birthday celebration coming up on July 4th, 2026, I think now is a particularly good time, an auspicious time, to revisit our founding principles and talk about why they matter today. Now, we actually have an interesting tech experience tonight. There's supposed to be a sort of central panel with a projector, but I'm told that that's on the fritz. We have some substitute panels here with television. It feels kind of like a sports bar. That's pretty cool. Hopefully this works out all right. The American political tradition is unique among political traditions. Patriotic Americans are at the same time radically conservative and radically liberal. The American political tradition is liberal because it is revolutionary. It was a movement in favor of universal rights that adhered not to a specific group of people at a specific time, but to all people everywhere, always. And in the service of those rights, a group of ragtag colonists took up arms and defied what was, up until that point, the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. But the American political tradition is also properly conservative. We have to preserve what has been handed to us. We have to realize these principles must be renewed in each generation. American liberty does not just happen. We receive it from the generation that came before us, we preserve it, we live it, we hopefully augment it, and we pass it on to the generation that comes after us. And so this is what I think the essence of the American political tradition turns upon: conserving and advancing liberty. Which gets us to this strange word in the book's title, libertarian. Maybe a word that not a lot of people are familiar with. It's not a very nice word, frankly. It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But I think the ideas that it expresses, the ideas that it contains, are just as relevant now as they were 250 years ago. So what is libertarianism, and why do we need to consider it? Here's a quote that I want to open with. The scene for this is the ratifying convention in Virginia, as the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Virginia, perhaps foremost among the revolutionary states, sorry New Englanders, were debating about whether they wanted to ratify the Constitution of the United States. Now, as you may or may not know, this Constitution that we have now was not our nation's first Constitution. During the War for Independence, the colonies, which had expressed a desire for unity and were acting collectively to resist Great Britain, were governed by a document known as the Articles of Confederation. That was actually our first Constitution. Now, due to several perceived inadequacies, emphasis on perceived, with that document, many delegates from many states gathered to debate whether they wanted to ratify a new governing document, which we now call the Constitution of the United States. And there was a lot of enthusiasm for revising the Articles of Confederation, for ratifying what we now call the Constitution, for creating a much stronger, more coherent, centralized government. With a stronger government, we could resist the powers of Europe, we could govern ourselves, we could secure our destinies, we could play the Game of Thrones with the empires of the world. We could make ourselves great, build a big old army, a big old navy, a consolidated government. America would make its footprint among the nations. But not everybody agreed. There were some who looked at this development with some trepidation. I want to read this quote by the founding father, Patrick Henry, spoken in the floor debate of the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788. If we admit this consolidated government, this new government, it will be because we like a great, splendid one. When the American spirit was in its youth, the language of America was different. And this is the part I want to emphasize. Liberty, sir, was then the primary object. That is what the American Revolution was about. We did not rebel against Great Britain because we wanted to be a great nation. We didn't want to play the international Game of Thrones. We didn't do this because we wanted to conquer. We didn't do this because we wanted to throw our weight around on the international scene. We did this because we wanted to be free. Because we wanted to govern ourselves according to natural rights. Because we wanted to free ourselves to express those rights. So that's the scene that I want to start with, this idea that the goal that we have to orient ourselves, however we choose to organize our government, the goal has to be liberty. That's what the revolution is for, and that is the principle that we have to keep in mind. This isn't to say that the Constitution is a bad document. I happen to think it's a fantastic document. I love it. My only concern is that, frankly, a lot of people don't seem to love it as much as I do. But we have to remember what it is for. It is not for national greatness. It is not for social justice. It is not for any abstraction that you could care to mention that subordinates actual people in their actual rights. The Constitution is for liberty. And if we don't start with that basic interpretive fact, everything that we derive from it is going to go awry. So taking libertarianism seriously, what do I mean by that word? It is nothing more and nothing less than the founding philosophy of the United States. It is a rational reconstruction of the project that the fathers of this nation were engaged in when they met in Philadelphia and declared their independence in 1776, when they met to frame the Articles of Confederation, when they revised those into the Constitution. It was an ongoing project to secure the blessings of liberty. What this means is a conscious devotion to liberty as the highest political goal. The highest political goal. The reason that we choose to organize politically is to protect our natural rights, which pre-exist government and do not come from government. They inherit in our nature as human beings. And governments, if they are just, must respect those rights in whatever they do. If you were to read the book, in the prologue I talk about defending the great themes of American honor, American wealth, and American freedom. Freedom I've talked about a lot already, and I'll talk about it some more. This is not the liberty of license. This is not, do whatever you want, everything goes. We believe in the United States in ordered liberty. We believe in liberty for the sake of virtue, of a good life, and virtue for the sake of liberty. These things are, in the language of economics, complements, not substitutes. We also believe in honor. We believe in keeping our word, keeping our obligations, not all of which are our own choice. Just because we believe that government has to answer to the consent of the governed does not mean that all moral obligations are founded upon explicit voluntary consent. We have obligations to our neighbors that transcend consent. They exist whether we acknowledge them or not. But nonetheless, the political bond, which is unique because of the institutions we establish to defend those liberties, do ultimately rest upon agreement and consent. And that is the thing that we have to take seriously. Wealth. Why is wealth important? Because that's the means of our sustenance. We create our own living. We create our own sustenance. We believe in private property. We believe in exchange. The market economy, free enterprise, is the greatest engine of wealth and human flourishing that we have yet discovered. But it doesn't automatically happen. It has an institutional context. Private property, the rule of law, limited government. These things cannot come if government dominates society. It only arises if governments secure the pre-existing rights of society. This is, in brief, the philosophy that animated the revolution, and it should be, I contend, the philosophy that continues to animate the American experiment today. This is in our founding documents. This isn't just some political philosopher who went crazy and decided to write a book about nothing in particular. You can read the documents themselves. They're right there screaming this language about the importance of liberties in everything we do. This is a quote by a president that I hold in great esteem, and I think this really gets at why the Declaration of Independence is important. If you know early American history, you know that the conflict between the colonists and Great Britain went through multiple phases. At first, we weren't really clear who the bad guy was. Was it Parliament? Was it the King? Was it one of them? Was it both of them? Who were we actually arguing against? Who did we intend to secure our rights against? Also, what was the nature of those rights that we intended to secure? In the early years of the conflict between the American colonies and Great Britain, starting with the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the language that the American colonists spoke to each other was, we are resisting Great Britain because we are standing on our ancient rights as Englishmen. It was particular, it was local, it was historically contingent. We are Englishmen, and Englishmen have these freedoms. But as the revolution unfolded, something miraculous happened. It wasn't just a claim made by a particular people with a particular history. It became universal. And that brings us to this quote by Abraham Lincoln. All honor to Thomas Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men at all times. Think about the intellectual and moral move that was made in this step. This wasn't just Englishmen claiming their rights as Englishmen. This was men and women claiming their rights as human beings. These rights are the common possession of all mankind, regardless of race, regardless of creed, religion, regardless of background. This is something that inheres in human nature. And in making that advance,
There was a jump in terms of who we saw ourselves as and what we stood for. We no longer stood for simply respecting the rights of a particular people given the traditions of Magna Carta, given the English Bill of Rights. These things are obviously important, but there was a magnitude, a phase shift here in terms of how we thought about the rights of persons. There's that famous passage in the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So right away that tells you that we're doing political philosophy. We are making a direction to, an appeal to human reason. All men are created equal, not in the sense that they're the same, not in the sense that they're interchangeable, right? I and LeBron James are created equal. He is very good at basketball. I am not good at basketball. Obviously, the Declaration is untrue, right? No, that's not what we're talking about. Of course, people differ in terms of their time, talent, treasure, accidental characteristics, but all humans are equally human persons. All bear the image of God. The Declaration says this, created by endowed by their creator is the language the document uses. Now, oftentimes, especially in this day and age, that can be a tripping point for some people who do not want to press or rest our rights on a theistic or religious foundation. And there are philosophies that you can embrace that are natural rights philosophies that do not make explicit recourse to God. But for me, I think that this philosophy only makes sense if you accept that basic way of looking at the world. You may disagree, and I would love to have that debate, but I think that this way of framing our rights makes it clear that we derive them from our Creator, that we bear the image, the spark of divinity within us, and that's why we have rights. All men created equal, endowed with rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. This is one that gets misinterpreted a lot. People see happiness and they think, oh, subjective mental satisfaction, warm fuzzies, that's what it's all about, right? No. They meant happiness in the philosophical sense, and the exact same that, say, Aristotle meant the word happiness. A flourishing life, a life of virtue. The ancient philosophers had an expression, count no man happy until he is dead. That sounds kind of stark. What does that mean? It means you can't truly tell whether someone lived a good life until you saw their life in its entirety. Did they flourish as a man, as a woman, as a human being? You can only view that in the sum total of the human experience of their life. And it is for that purpose that the Declaration proclaims the right to the pursuit of happiness. And of course, there are all sorts of rights that are downstream from that. The right of private property is downstream from that. The consent of the governed. Why does the consent of the governed matter? Because we're talking about how to do things politically, which means we are talking about how to do things that is sanctioned by violence. That's what politics ultimately comes down to. We don't pay our taxes because we simply like what they all go to. We pay taxes because if we don't, presumably at some point, I'm not sure about the government's record keeping these days, but if we do, somebody is going to show up at your house with a gun and bad things will happen to you. That is an awesome power. Where can it safely rest? Only with an institution that is answerable to the people over whom it wields that power. That's why consent in government is so important. And this quote by Lincoln that I just showed you goes to show you that there is something about this that is universal, that requires us to live up to it on an ongoing basis. Liberty in the American context always means ordered liberty. Again, we are not talking about creating a country so everybody can just do whatever makes them happy in the moment. We are called to higher ends than liberty. Liberty is itself instrumental. There's an economist who I like very much named James Buchanan who wrote that man wants liberty to become the man he wants to become. Freedom is valuable precisely because of how we give it away. We need to be able to choose how we bind ourselves. That freedom to associate, to pursue virtual communally in our fraternal societies, in our religious organizations, in our institutions of education. These are all ways that we relinquish our freedom to pursue common projects, but the choice has to rest with you, because virtue cannot be coerced. Freedom is not the highest end of man, virtue is, but freedom is the highest political end of man. It's why we associate to form governments. It's why we actually get together for this common project, to secure us the social space in which we can live lives flourishing amongst our neighbors. Here's a philosopher who normally I actually don't like very much. I've read a lot of Thomas Paine. I think Common Sense is pretty good, but if you're familiar with his later works, he kind of drank the Kool-Aid on the French Revolution. He really went down the deep end of Rousseau, total absolute equality, abolish all inherited institutions. I would encourage you not to go down that route. One of the great things about the United States is it is a prudential project, equally bit as prudential as it is principled. And I think that this quote is one that I can endorse fully. Society is in every state a blessing, but government, even in the best state, is but a necessary evil. What does Thomas Paine mean by society? It means what we're doing right now, getting together to talk about the affairs that we have in common. It means when we show up together to worship on the Sabbath. It means when we get together to provide for a neighbor in need. It means meeting in lodges, fraternal societies, educational institutions. We act collectively all the time. And it's good that we do, because most of the projects that we hold most dear cannot be accomplished except as a group, except when we come together. But that is not necessarily what makes government what it is. Government is different in one specific way. Government is uniquely coercive. The power of the state is always and always will be the power to compel obedience. That's why we have to be very careful about what powers we give to the government versus which we decide to reserve to ourselves in our separate capacities. There was a president that we had recently who has a quote that I really, really hate. Government is just another name for the things that we do together. With all due respect, President Obama, no, it is not. Government is not synonymous with collective action. I want to emphasize this again because this is the single most important and distinctive point, I would argue, of the libertarian philosophy underlying the American Revolution. Now, I'm going to give you another quote, which is apocryphally attributed to George Washington. I can't find any actual proof that he said this, but knowing the Founding Fathers, I can absolutely believe that one of them did. Government is not reason. It is not eloquence. It is force. Like fire, it is a fearful servant and a terrible master. When you choose to do things politically, what you are choosing to do is force a one-size-fits-all solution on the whole population. And maybe, due to some tragic necessity, that's how we have to do some things. Maybe we choose to finance the army that way, via coercive taxation, because otherwise we're worried that we just won't have the means to defend ourselves and preserve ourselves in freedom. That's why Thomas Paine said that government was a necessary evil. Even at best, it's tragic that we have to use violence and the threat of violence to get people to pursue some of their ends this way. So the best way to do that, to make sure that we have a society on as voluntary and as non-coercive a basis as possible, is to do as little as possible through the government, especially the national government. We have two ways, of course, of controlling the government and holding it accountable to us. The main way we do this, and the one you're probably thinking of right now, is what economists call the power of voice. This is what you exercise when you vote. This is what most people think of when they think of the consent of the government. But there's also the power of exit. We don't just have one jurisdiction here in the United States. We, of course, have the national government, Washington, D.C. It's kind of hard to exit from that one. But we also have the states. We have cities. We have municipalities. We have counties. And it is much easier to choose which jurisdiction on a local basis you live under. That, too, is a way of pursuing liberty. One of the things that I get a lot when I give this talk is, Professor Salter, what you're saying makes sense. But isn't it true that sometimes we need to discover the optimal boundary between the private and public sector? We can't just assume a priori what people want to do. Shouldn't we have a larger role for government? My response is the Founding Fathers would have agreed with you, which is why we have federalism. That's exactly what it is for. We allow governments at more local levels to have a more expansive scope for collective action underneath governmental powers, precisely because if I don't like how Lubbock is governed, I'm sure I will, I'm sure I will like how Lubbock is governed. But if I choose not to enjoy how Lubbock is governed, there are other cities in Texas that I can locate to that will protect my rights better. And if I have a problem with Texas, well, it's not that hard to get to Florida. In contrast, if I have a problem with what's going on in Washington, where do I go? It's really hard to switch countries. You can do it, but the host country has to accept you. I don't need anybody's permission to move to Florida except the person whose house I'm buying. I need the permission of the government of France if, God help me, I ever wanted to move to France. It's really difficult to protect yourself against overbearing, rights-violating government the higher up we move. That's why we have this structured layer. It was baked into the project from the beginning. Another attractive feature of the libertarian political philosophy is the moral symmetry at its heart. There's no double standard here in terms of who is doing what to people. If it is wrong for somebody to dispose of your property without your consent, it doesn't matter if that person has a badge on their chest or not. It doesn't matter if that person comes from the IRS or not. If your property is your property and can't be disposed of without your consent, then the government has to follow that moral law too. We do not exempt public actors simply because they are governmental agents from the moral code to which we hold all human beings. That is central. But why emphasize liberty so strongly? Why is liberty good? Depends on your personal approach to moral philosophy. And here's where political philosophy actually can get beyond itself and get into moral philosophy, ethics. Philosophers have been arguing for thousands and thousands of years about the nature of the good, what makes something good, what makes something bad. They're probably never going to come to an agreement, but that's okay, because I think that on any way you look at it, liberty is valuable. The view that's embedded in the Declaration of Independence, the rights-based view, is sometimes called a duty-centered view of liberty. You have to respect your fellow man's rights because of the kind of thing that he or she is and the kind of thing that you are. I am a human being. I bear the image of the divine, just like you. We exercise reason. Through reason, we can come to discover how to live better together. And because we are those kinds of beings that can reason together in community, I have to respect your dignity. You have to respect mine. I must treat you as an end in yourself and never as a means to my own end. That would be a duty-based conception for liberty. But there's also the argument from consequences. I'm not a huge fan of consequentialism as a philosophy, but nonetheless, we have to acknowledge that consequences matter. You want consequences? I got one for you. Since the Industrial Revolution, since the spread of private property rights, the rule of law, limited government, the average person, not elites, right? The average person has experienced an 85-fold increase in his or her standard of living. Income per head per person per year has gone up by a factor of 85. That's not 85%, that means multiply by 85. I don't think most people realize just how well ordinary Americans have it today. Everybody in this room, by historical standards, is unfathomably wealthy compared to our grandparents, their parents before them. And this is due to a free enterprise economy, which comes from leaving people alone to make their own decisions about how to employ their property rights. Don't beat people up, don't take their stuff. That's a really, really good founding principle for how to organize economic activity. It brings home the bacon. It delivers the goods. Free enterprise, liberty works. And of course, there are virtue-centered theories of liberty. Why respect liberty? Because in order for you to become a good person, in order for you to become courageous, temperate, just, you have to develop certain moral habits. We are what we repeatedly do, Aristotle said 2,500 years ago. But in order to acquire those moral habits, they have to be freely chosen. You can have guardrails, right? Especially as you're young, especially as you're being brought up, right? That's part of the reason the family is such an important institution. The family is really the first school of liberty before even politics. But eventually you have to do it because it is the right thing to do. A soldier who only stands in the face of the enemy because he was afraid of being shot for desertion, whatever else he might be in terms of his virtues, is not courageous. Somebody who is only charitable because they're giving money because the government is forcing them to, through taxes, is not actually practicing charity. They're just doing it because you don't want to go to jail. When you do these things with force, you are depriving the person who is being coerced of the chance to learn how to become a better, fuller, flourishing human being. We care about our capacities, and that's why we need liberty, to give us the social space to craft the virtues. What is the central project that American founding fathers embraced to create the social space to give us liberty? It's all well and good to talk about the philosophy, but if it doesn't have teeth, we can't live it. It needs to have force. Something must give it force. And now we get to the challenges of constitutional design. I really don't think that we've advanced at all beyond what James Madison wrote in 1788. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and here's where the italics come in, because this part's important, and then in the next place, oblige the government to control itself. This is a twofold project. It's a delicate balancing act, creating a government that's powerful enough to actually oversee its community while also not exceeding its mandate. Any government that is powerful enough to protect your rights is also powerful enough to take them away. And this is the central challenge of government. This is why we can never, as Americans, rest on our laurels, because it's never done. There is no done. This only works so long as every generation is jealous of its liberty and actively works to keep government within its proper bounds. So what are the institutional safeguards that actually protect our rights? What forms of social organization can we turn to make this work? One of them, as we've talked about, is federalism. The Constitution of the United States establishes and legitimates the national government. It does not, however, legitimate and establish the state governments. Who knows why? That's right, because they were already around. They had been around for a very long time, first as colonies, then as separate independent states, then as states united together. The states don't need a justification for their existence. They predated 1776. The colonists had already been governing themselves locally for hundreds of years. The Constitution established the national government. The Constitution legitimates the national government. And the Constitution keeps that government within strict bounds. If you want a more expansive role for the public sector, and you should always be cautious about wanting that, but if you want it, the place to do that is at the state level. You want the government to be involved in education, healthcare? Okay, frankly, I disagree, but if you think that that's the way to go, keep it in Austin. Don't pass the buck to Washington, D.C. I got news for you, you're not really good at it. Constitutional interpretation. We need, in order for this document to have force, to understand what the people who wrote it and ratified meant by it. Here's my radical philosophy of constitutional interpretation. Are you ready? The Constitution is a legal document. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. That's it. There's nothing special about the Constitution. It is a legal document like any other legal document. You interpret the words in that document according to the public meaning at the time those laws or ordinances were passed. What is this in contrast to? Living constitutionalism, which is just a fancy way of saying we can ignore the text and have the words mean whatever we want them to mean. Why does that violate liberty and self-governance? Because the citizens of this country, when they assented to the Constitution, consented to those laws on the understanding that the words meant what they meant. The word regulate in the Constitution did not mean tinker with administratively. In the late 18th century, the word regulate meant to keep regular, to keep ordinary, to keep the juices flowing, in other words. So when the Constitution authorizes the national government to regulate commerce, it is not actually authorizing the government to do the vast majority of the things that it does today. It's simply to have government be a referee. Instead, too often it has become a player in the game. When you make that move of reinterpreting the Constitution, you have de facto modified the Constitution. And the people can do that. We are a free and self-governing people. You can modify, meaning amend the Constitution. but the document itself contains its own amendment procedures. And if you do an end run about those, that's not self-governance anymore. That's some people purporting to rule other people in light of their personal preferences. That does not comport to liberty. It's important also to remember the 9th and 10th Amendments. An eminent legal philosopher in the era of Robert Bork, I don't think this actually was Bork, but it was a colleague of his, wrote that the 9th and 10th Amendments are really just ink blots on the Constitution. And I don't think that he was happy about that fact. He was noting the fact that in Supreme Court jurisprudence, very few important cases were actually decided on the basis of the 9th or 10th Amendments. That's tragic, because those are some of the most important amendments in the document. 9th Amendment basically says we cannot possibly write down all the rights that you have. The enumeration of these rights does not mean you don't have other ones. The 10th Amendment, any rights not delegated to the national government are retained by the states or the people. This is the interpretive key for how to understand the project of constitutionalism. We need to get back to a state of affairs where the government has the burden of proof for acting, not the citizens have the burden of proof to stop the government from acting. We have to remember that what makes government government is that it is the institution with a monopoly on legitimized force. Only Uncle Sam gets to initiate violence to resolve its disputes. That makes it uniquely powerful. That also makes it uniquely dangerous. That's why we have to constrain it, because of how it does things, not necessarily because of what it does. Another president whom I admire, although he quite frankly did not go far enough in his war with the New Deal and the Great Society, but I like him nonetheless. Freedom is never more than a single generation away. It has to be fought from extinction. It has to be fought for and defended by each generation. It's kind of easy to look at that and think, wow, that doesn't sound too good. That sounds kind of ominous. But there's a silver lining. If freedom has to be defended and lived by each generation, that means that's never more than one generation away from renewal. The sword cuts both ways. If we have to fight to keep it all the time, that means that we're always on the cusp of getting it back. We haven't lost it forever, because it can't be lost forever. That's the optimism with which we turn to this admittedly daunting project. We have lots of political problems at the national level. We've got lots of political problems at the state and local level too, but I would suggest that those are more readily solvable. Here are some of the problems we're going to have to here are some of the problems we have to get serious about solving in the next couple of years. We can't wait anymore. The circumstances do not permit that. The national debt now exceeds the size of the economy. The U.S. economy is roughly 38 trillion. The national debt is roughly 40 trillion, which means we are indebted more than the value of all newly produced goods and services in the country over the course of a year. Add up all the stuff that we produce in America over a year. That's how much our debt is. Oh, and by the way, that radically understates how far in the red we are. Because in addition to that, we have to account for what's called unfunded liabilities, future payments of programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid that we know we're going to have to pay. We just don't know precisely how big those payments are yet, because frankly, we don't know how long people are going to live, when they're going to retire, and that affects your Social Security payout. When you choose to retire, affects the size of the check you get every month. If you add those up, some estimates put the magnitude of unfunded liabilities, which the government will have to pay, which means that all of us in this room will have to pay, at 200 trillion. Trillion with a T. Here's some context. The GDP of the entire world is about 200 trillion. Add up the value of all the goods and services that every country on earth makes every year. That's how much you and I, the taxpayers of this nation, are on the line for right now. The books don't balance. We're going to have to find a way to fix that. Regulation. Fixing the fiscal problems would actually go a lot easier if we had a dynamic economy, if we could get the growth rate of the economy up. How can we do that? We have, quite frankly, too much regulation in this country. The Federal Register is Washington's rule book for the rest of us. All right? When we first started getting administrative law and administrative procedures of the modern kind in the 1920s, the Federal Register had about 2,000 pages per year. In 2022, that was 80,000 new pages of rules and regulation added every every year that businesses have to comply with. Not just giant corporations, but small to medium-sized businesses, independent enterprises, where most of us live and work. It is really hard to produce wealth when you have all these rules that raise the cost of engaging in economic activity. Most of this is occurring without any meaningful congressional oversight, which is another problem. This is the administrative state. No legislative accountability, no check on the growth of those regulations. We need to get that under control, not only because it's good for the economy, but because restoring Congress's rightful place as the rightful overseer of all these rules actually introduces, once again, an important political check on the growth of the political process. And that gets us to number 3. Ultimately, if we want liberty, we have to limit the scale and scope of government. Government does too much. It's too expensive. We need to put it back on the leash. That's going to mean, on the one hand, reining in executive branch agencies, which unfortunately in many cases have become a law unto themselves. One of the things that I do in my professional life is I study the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States. There is an institution that's very, very hard to govern. It is almost impossible to hold Fed decision makers to account for the mistakes that they make. And they do make mistakes. How many of you remember that really big bout of inflation you just lived under from 2021 to 2024? That was monetary policy. That was a central bank that made a mistake. Who got in trouble because of it? Who got fired because of it? Nobody. And nobody ever will. Because the Fed is de facto unaccountable. That's a problem in terms of voluntary congressional government. We need to make sure that there's at least some check on these agencies. Otherwise, the people's representatives, who are actually answerable to you and me, have no voice in making the rules that we all have to live under. And quite frankly, even within the executive branch, the office of the president is too powerful. The presidency is just too powerful. The president does too much. I don't care if it's Donald Trump, I don't care if it's Joe Biden, the president does too much. The president was never supposed to be an independent creator of public policy. The executive is supposed to execute the law, not make the law. And yet we've gotten to a state of affairs where administrative orders, executive orders are the de facto legislative language we speak. That's totally unacceptable from a constitutional standpoint. If we care about liberty, it's time to rein that in. This is the other president who duels with Ronald Reagan for my personal favorite president in the 20th century. If you don't know a whole lot about the life and presidency of Calvin Coolidge, I would really encourage you to go out and read about him. He's a fascinating figure. He gave a speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. All right, so we're coming up to 100 years since he made this remark. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. No advance, no progress can be made beyond these propositions. He was writing in response to a group of politicians, political philosophers, and jurists who believed that the nation had outgrown its founding principles. This was the heyday of the progressive movement in the early 1920s, who thought that limited government, checks and balances, separation of powers, all of that was obsolete. All of that had to go by the wayside. Like the nation had just recently lived through the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, who more than any other president had open contempt for the founding principles of this country. Coolidge was saying, if that's the direction you want to go, realize that there's no direction to go backwards. You say that you're advancing on our principles, but really you're a reactionary. You believe in the right of the elite few to govern the many without their consent. That is not consistent with the principles upon which this nation is founded. So that means that we have a choice now. We can recognize with Coolidge that in terms of principles, what we need is not new ideas, but to live up to the old ones. It is a daunting project, but it is possible. There are lots of things that need to be fixed, and that requires more than anything a citizenry attentive to those problems and willing to attend to the cares and responsibilities of living under freedom. we do have a choice. We can rebuild the city upon a hill, or we can continue our descent into the company of unremarkable nations. That is the question we have to answer on our nation's 250th birthday. What kind of country do we want to be? What kind of people do we want to be? What do we stand for? I suggest we stand for liberty. Thank you very much.
I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate your perspective. I consider myself more of a conservative than a libertarian, and one of the reasons is I find a lot of libertarians are so ideologically strapped, to their ideology, and the political ramifications of their ideology oftentimes don't allow them to operate very well in what is really a political environment, with different opinions and trying. I face this, I've got a lot of principles, but when you're trying to do something as a governing body or whatever, you have to balance them against the people you serve, and a lot of their interests and concerns don't always align with the principles. And so that's been always my frustration. How do you address that? Because the emphasis is so much on freedom, and not just individual freedom, it is the freedom of all of us. I think that's what needs to be said. It's not my freedom. It's all of our freedom, all of our liberties. If I don't want it for you, but I only want it for me, well, I don't think I'm truly a libertarian, am I? We have to want it for each other. But where do conservative principles, general conservative principles, come into a libertarian's perspective when it comes to governing?
Great question. Thank you very much, Mayor McBrayer. I think that if I'm understanding you correctly, there are two issues here. The first is, how can we hold these principles while still acting productively in the realm of actual day-to-day politics? That's one question, right? That's a very important question. As I understand it, libertarianism is a philosophy about where we want to go. But it does not have a whole lot to say in the abstract about the best way to get there. There is room for genuine statesmanship here. There has to be. The Founding Fathers were phenomenally talented statesmen. One of the things that impresses me so much about reading their writings even today is that these men were just top-tier intellects, philosophers of liberty, but they were also very skilled political operators. They were actually capable of using the reins of power to advance the ends of liberty. I would argue that if you want a libertarian society, you need to have libertarian people in politics who also know how to practice statesmanship. I think that that's very important. I don't think that there's anything un-libertarian about being good at politics. You need to be good at politics. The second question, I think, was about the sort of broader social philosophy that we embrace. I agree with you wholly that libertarianism, if it transcends philosophy and becomes ideology, can really blind us to a lot of the more important things in life. I myself think that libertarianism makes sense as the political expression of the broader social philosophical thought of the Western tradition. Right? I look to Jerusalem for my religion. I look to Athens for my philosophy. I look to Rome for my legal institutions. And I look to England for my law. I think that that's how the Founding Fathers thought about it. The vast majority of them were deeply religious men. Right? We sometimes get the idea that the American founding was sort of this rationalist, maybe deist project among people who didn't really believe in ordinary conceptions of God. And yeah, Ben Franklin was kind of like that, Thomas Jefferson was kind of like that, and John Adams was a Unitarian. Those are the big names, but if you actually look at the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, the vast majority of them were faithful Trinitarian Christians, and that's where they get their philosophy from. They wanted freedom because they knew that they had to pursue their higher ends in local voluntary community. They wanted freedom from an overbearing, distant government so that they could live lives of Christian virtue more locally. Now, not everybody in this audience might be a Christian. Liberty is still for you. I am a Christian, perhaps you are, perhaps you are not. That does not mean that you have to repudiate liberty. This is not some theocentric political project. We're not here to force our religious beliefs on you, because that is not how you can have an authentic relationship with God, and that's not how you can have an authentic expression of liberty. But I think it does mean you have to take seriously, if you believe in the rights of man, those rights have to come from somewhere. You can ground them in human nature, but then why is human nature the way it is? Where does that come from? Ultimately, we all have to make our own decisions about how much we want to explain, how much we want to incorporate into our social philosophy. But I think that libertarianism as a political philosophy does fit in very well with a more conservative social philosophy.
As a member of Gen Z, we've noticed a trend of corporations and banks having more rights and sovereignty over citizens. We currently live in a corporatist oligarchy where citizens are disregarded and our privacy and our rights are definitely disregarded. And in the way of the government and like operations like CIA, FBI, things like 2001, putting in acts that break our privacy. What would you say to my generation to take back our liberty, take back our freedom, our wealth, and our rights back?
Great question. The place to start is to recognize that your concern is well-founded. Some of capitalism's biggest enemies are capitalists. Big corporations are not necessarily virtuous, especially when they turn to the political process to grant them special privileges. That is unfortunately common. Where do you think those 80,000 pages a year come from? Yeah, they're passed by administrative entities, right? But oftentimes, private actors, oftentimes private parties lobby for those rules. Because big corporations that are already established and can afford an entire compliance team of lawyers know that they can cope with those rules more than young, nimble competitors. Crony capitalism is not free enterprise. You have every right to be complained about the deck being stacked against honest business. That is absolutely true. So I think the place to start is to recognize that not all businessmen and women are friends of free enterprise. Oftentimes they actively undermine free enterprise. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why I think it's so important to study economics, because that's a really good way of learning who's trying to pull one over on you. Right? You can look after the 2008 financial crisis at all these banks that were talking about, well, we needed these taxpayer-funded bailouts, otherwise the financial system would melt down. Well, maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. The question is, how did we get in that tragic situation in the first place? It's because the head of every large Wall Street bank was essentially given a really good deal. Flip a coin. Heads, you win lots and lots of money. Tails, technically you go bankrupt, but guess what? You're going to get a taxpayer bailout anyway. If you were told that you could go to Las Vegas using somebody else's credit card, wouldn't that affect how you gamble? It absolutely would. You would take more risk. So all of this bad behavior is built into the system. We have to get serious about understanding economics and social philosophy so we can spot the malfeasance. And then once you do that, I would argue that there are certain non-negotiables when you go to the voting booth. For me, I can't in good conscience vote for anybody who votes to increase the deficit in terms of a legislator. Like, I have a rule in my head. The budget is allowed to grow by the combination of population growth and inflation. The government can spend more money when the dollar gets depreciated. The government can spend more money when there are more people to spend on. But if you follow that rule, government expenditures per person in constant dollars would freeze. And economic growth could start to alleviate our debt burden. This is one time when, quite frankly, I have a bone to pick with the National Republican Party, especially. Because they sound like Ronald Reagan and Calvin Coolidge on the campaign trail. And then they get into office and they vote for these budget-busting bills. And they expect you guys to foot the bill. That's another hard thing, right? Within 6 years, we're not going to have enough money to pay Social Security, everything that we promised. Which means that somebody somewhere is going to have to start taking a haircut. I would suggest to young people to think seriously when you're budgeting for your own life and your own retirement to consider the troubling possibility that you're never going to get a Social Security check. The money
money's probably not going to be there. Your anger is justified. The question is, what do we do about it to fix the problem? That's a tough question of political organization. I can't do anything more in this talk than give you a couple of like top-level principles, but hold accountable, especially the people who claim to be defending liberty. If I hear somebody talk about how great the Constitution and free markets are, that person had better walk the walk. And if they don't in office, you should never honor that person with your vote again.
It is a common sentiment expressed by many of the founders that the Constitution is a document written for a Christian people with broadly Anglo-Saxon values, as you said. They're acutely aware of their Britishness. And a population that is contiguous geographically. Adams expressed this, Sam Adams expressed this as well, Madison, Jefferson, Washington. Is everything that we've sort of talked about this evening contingent on that sort of population existing? And I guess if you disagree with that, why would you disagree with that?
I do believe that liberty has cultural and social prerequisites. You don't get it just anywhere. It was a long, long process that culminated in the American experiment. I see American liberty as the outgrowth of the Western political, philosophical, social tradition. Right? It has these roots, it has these antecedents. It didn't just happen there for no reason. And I think that there's a reason that you do look to post-Enlightenment, late 18th century Western Europe and the Anglosphere especially, for these kinds of political movements. At the same time, I truly do think that there is something universal about liberty. I do think it speaks to something common in our human nature. So just because you didn't come from that culture doesn't mean you can't espouse those values and become a liver of liberty in that way. How do we actually make that work, right? Especially right now when we're talking about difficult questions of immigration. Right? Who should be in? Who should be out? My perspective on these questions, quite frankly, is that immigration is generally good and we should want more of it. Because I think that the kind of people who come to the United States are going to be the kind of people who do love American liberty. I'm not opposed to the idea of making sure that those who would come to live here and work here actually do espouse American values. I'm not 100% a proposition nationalist. I do believe that America is partly a nation constituted by history, shared experience. But I also believe that ideas are more important for the American experiment than they are for any other country that has existed yet. So I think it should be the case that the people that we welcome should be enthusiastic about American liberty. I don't think that it's wrong to want that. And I think that if you look at the empirical social science literature on the consequences of immigration, my boss, Ben Powell, has done great work on this. Immigration, provided the host country is competently governed, actually does have good effects for liberty, for institutional quality, right? The economic consequences are pretty obvious. More people, more stuff, right? The economy becomes more productive. You might worry about whether the institutions erode, though, if we're quote-unquote importing people who, vote for statist and anti-libertarian things. As far as we can tell, that's not happening. As far as we can tell, the kind of people who self-select into the kinds of countries that are governed according to pro-liberty ethoses, ethi? You're the philosopher, you tell me what the plural of that word is. It does seem to be the case that we can incorporate that many people. We should be on the lookout for fraud. We should be on the lookout for people who are looking to take advantage of American generosity. But for those who actively believe in those values, I think that we should welcome them. So we have an interest both in making sure that newcomers espouse American liberty, but we also have an interest in making sure that we do not turn people away from fear.
I think that's all that we have time for now, but maybe if you have other questions, you can come up and ask Alex at the end. Please join me in thanking Alex. Thank you.